Hi, I'm Tim. Remote ID is back in the news. There is a June 6th, 2024 report from the Government Accountability Office reviewing remote ID for the FAA. And what they're saying in a nutshell is remote ID needs improvements. It's not living up to its potential, and commercial operators are pushing hard for a network solution to remote ID. So let's jump into this, discuss it, and let's get to it. This video is being filmed on June 12th, 2024, and there are two things that happened quite recently that affect drones, RC model airplanes, and our ability to fly recreationally. That was the passage of the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2024 that was passed by both houses of Congress, signed by President Biden on May 16th, 2024. And then, just 3 weeks later, on June 6, 2024, the Government Accountability Office released a year-long report where they were tasked by Congress to investigate remote ID, see how it's working, see if remote ID is doing what was believed to be the promises of the FAA in ensuring safe airspace for drones, and a way for police to quickly identify illegal drone activities and facilitate commercial drone operations. The FAA Act is a really big deal. It is for 4 years. It's good through September 30th of 2028. It is $66.7 billion, and it provides all sorts of guidance for the FAA from commercial air traffic to general aviation to include drones. One thing that I'll talk about at the end, it's a bit of good news, is the FAA has a FRIA, an FAA recognized identification area, where recreational drone operators can fly without any remote ID in designated FRIA areas. There was some concern that FRIAs would go away, they wouldn't last. There was a complete endorsement in FRIAs and even a requirement of the FAA to further support them through 2028. We'll get to that towards the end of the video. But the two things are the FAA Act has been signed. There is language directing the FAA to examine a remote ID to see if it's doing what it should be done, and that will be important for us for recreational drone pilots or RC model airplane pilots. Thank you in advance for any like and subscribes. It really helped the channel a lot. Also, if you'd like to jump ahead to a certain section, just down below there are chapters in the timeline, so you can go where you'd like to go in the video. So first, let's go over a little bit of what the Government Accountability Office is. Who are they, and why are we concerned at all about the report? And the Government Accountability Office, I'm reading from their information here, is an independent, nonpartisan government agency within the legislative branch, as Congress, that provides auditing, evaluative, and investigative services for the U.S. Congress. It's the supreme audit institution of the federal government of the United States. The GAO was set up in 1929. They have over 3,000 employees. Their budget is $637 million with headquarters in Washington, D.C. And what they do, among other things, is when they are requested by members of Congress or congressional committees or subcommittees, they can do a variety of auditing tasks. It could be audit agency operations to see if money is being spent correctly. They can investigate illegal, improper activities. They can issue legal decisions and opinions. And in the case of remote ID, they can report how well government programs and policies are meeting their objectives. So what will happen is they're independent people, they're auditors, they have technical staff. They can provide data and research. So if somebody from Congress, a member of Congress, or somebody in one of the subcommittees wants to do further action on something, see how something is working, they have factual information to work on. It just helps them do their job properly. And one footnote, because the GAO can find so much money being misspent or not properly spent, whether it's the Defense Department, the FAA, or any other government agency, the return is they get about $338 back to the U.S. government for every dollar they spend just by asking the right questions. And so the measurable benefits of the GAO work total about $215 billion from waste, overspending, something wrong that they found out. So the GAO spent a year studying the remote ID situation with the FAA. They read the act, they understand what it's supposed to do, and they interviewed anybody they wanted to. They interviewed the FAA, they interviewed various users, And what we're going to find that's the important thing for this report as part of their interview process to include law enforcement agencies. The GAO interviewed commercial drone operators, and the commercial drone operators, and this is going to be a theme running through drone operations in this video and for a long time into the future. The commercial drone operators want to have relatively free access to fly in the national airspace system, whether they're flying for UPS, Amazon, whatever, to do their drone operations. The commercial drone operators feel to have full access to the national airspace system, there has to be some sort of network for remote ID so the FAA can see where these drones are. The FAA is not necessarily controlling them or talking to them, but the commercial drone operators say, if we don't have a network-based solution, we're not going to realize the full potential of commercial drone operators. As we'll discuss here in a moment, right now remote ID is a broadcast-only system. You can only track drones when they're flying with a broadcast system. Once they've landed, there's no national database to plug into to see where they are, where they've been, or who has been flying them. One other very important item or element of the GAO to keep in mind is they're just auditors. They can ask questions, they can issue a report. They are not elected officials. They have no power to tell anybody to do anything. They simply provide information to members of Congress to take further action. So it's not like a bill with the FAA where Congress has passed that, the president has signed it, you have to do something. The GAO really makes recommendations, and then the government agencies see where it goes from there. There could be a follow-on investigation, but the GAO cannot direct anybody to do anything. So in a nutshell, what is remote ID? There are countless videos of remote ID, but basically remote ID is a new regulation from the FAA that's essentially a digital license plate in the sky. The idea is there is a methodology to identify the pilot of flying that drone. So in case there is a violation of airspace or some regulation, the FAA, local law enforcement can identify who's flying that drone. It is absolutely foundational for aviation. The FAA needs to know who's flying airplanes. It was always fairly easy when it was manned aircraft because you could see where it's land, you could find the pilot. With drones, it's a lot harder because they're drones, they fly everywhere, and they just needed some methodology to identify the pilot. So it started back about 2020 or so with a draft notice of proposed rulemaking where the FAA outlined what they thought they had to do for this remote ID. And this was a big deal because for the first time, recreational drone and RC model airplane pilots were going to be covered by an FAA regulation. We had never been covered by regulations up to then. The draft notice was not a good start. The FAA did not know much about unmanned aircraft systems, drones or RC models. And one of the big features of the draft notice was that the FAA wanted all RC and drone pilots to log into some sort of national database before they took off to track their flying. That would involve a lot of fees to use this database. It was pointed out that there are large sections of the country where you couldn't get cell phone access. As of the nature of any proposed rulemaking, they were allowed to make comments. Over 53,000 comments came back on this. There was a lot of involvement with stakeholders, Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, Experimental Aircraft Association, and the Academy of Model Aeronautics. A lot of discussion going back and forth. What had happened was a couple things that came out in support of recreational flyers. First of all, the remote ID was a broadcast-only system. You didn't have to log into a database. The remote ID would simply broadcast the model's location when the model was flying. Also, as part of the technical definition of remote ID, it didn't say it had to go a certain range. It just had to meet some technical specifications. The actual range of where you could receive that signal was never defined. It would depend on atmospheric conditions, who made it, a range of things, which I always thought was kind of odd. Also, two other things, because the focus is drones, because drones fly a lot of places for the simple reason they take pictures, so they're incentivized to go a lot of places in their flight. Fixed-wing RC model airplanes, by and large, will tend to stay at a club airfield or fixed flying site because we are watching our models fly. So what had happened was, as of December of 2022, for remote ID, is what they call standard ID. Remote ID had to be built into the drone before it could be sold. So any drone you purchase today has remote ID built in. For the fixed-wing RC models, helicopters, you had to buy a separate module that you could plug into your model to be compliant with remote ID. The other thing that happened was the FAA allowed for a FRIA and FAA recognized identification area, where once your club is established with a FRIA, you can fly your RC models at that club field without any remote ID whatsoever, because the FAA knows where you're flying in that FRIA. So that was the outcome of all that. The final rules published on the remote ID, it was due to come in September 16th of 2023. There were not enough remote ID modules available. The FAA slipped enforcement of that to March 16th of 2024. So this is being filmed June 12th of 2024. Everybody's expected to be compliant with the remote ID rules, to include if you're flying in a FRIA where you do not need remote ID. Also, remote ID only required for models over 250 grams, about 8.8 ounces. So why did the GAO do this study of remote ID? The GAO points out that drones are the fastest growing segment of aviation in the United States. And the remote ID is intended to help the FAA, law enforcement, and others locate drone operators flying in an unsafe manner or where prohibited. And this is just part of the FAA's responsibility for ensuring safety in the national airspace system. And also, you'll hear this throughout the report, remote ID is believed to help enable advanced drone operations. Advanced drone operations is the same thing for commercial operations. As I mentioned at the beginning, the commercial operators really want a robust remote ID system tied into a national network to facilitate their work with the FAA flying basically where they want to go. So the report was issued, as I mentioned, June 6th of 2024. The GAO found that the FAA and the Department of Homeland Security, in their view, need to do more to ensure that FAA's regulations requiring remote identification for drones accomplish the goals of helping law enforcement agencies combat unsafe drone operations and paving the way for the full integration of drone operations into the U.S. airspace. The GAO took about a year preparing this report. They found that the FAA, quote, has limited resources to support tribal, state, and local law enforcement in the use of remote ID technology to quickly identify drone operators flying in an unsafe manner. And what they found out as a GAO interviewed the FAA has databases of registration, and they have a law enforcement assistance program to coordinate with local law enforcement officers on unsafe drone activities. We know local police are very busy with different priorities doing things. They don't have enough people or really concerned many times to respond to a drone incident. And also, it's not easy for the local police to find out that registration information. It turned out in the course of the GAO investigation, the FAA just has 25 people assigned to the LEAP program. They're doing other things with smuggling items in through aircraft. It can literally take up to 48 hours to get a response if law enforcement asks on a drone registration to find out who the pilot is. And what's happening is the Homeland Security, the FAA, other organizations in the U.S. government, they are realizing more and more they've got to have a quick way to respond to something. The example that keeps coming up is NFL football games. From 22 to 2023, there were approximately 2,500 observations of drones flying over some sort of college or National Football League football game where they shouldn't be flying at that time. There was even a case in the beginning of 2024 where during an NFL game, play had to be stopped because of an unauthorized drone flying over the stadium. Law enforcement authorities are very concerned about something bad happening with that drone, with a lot of people there, and they are looking for some way to quickly be able to respond to that, which fed into this GAO report. So as the GAO was preparing this report on remote ID, they talked to commercial drone operators, and the industry people, everyone they talked to, advocated the creation of a network-based system, such as one that relied on cellular network signals, quote, as a foundational piece for enabling more advanced operations with the drones. However, the FAA said, as I mentioned before, when they did the draft notice of proposed rulemaking, there was great pushback on the network system. And frankly, I don't think the technology existed to really have a functioning network-based system when they wrote the original rule. So the final remote ID rule went to a broadcast-only system, which is what we have now. Again, the commercial operators feel that's just not sufficient for the growth they see and the flexibility of their commercial drones that they would like to do. So the response to the FAA to the complaints about the network system is that the FAA would literally rely on the drone industry to continue developing network-based technologies that may allow for integrating advanced drone operations. So the FAA goes, we're not arguing with the network-based system. We can't produce that. We're going to hope that the drone operators do something about that. However, the drone industry counters that they don't want to incorporate both types of remote ID systems, a broadcast system and a network-based system. It's expensive, too hard to do, could be interference. They're just pushing back on that. So this leads up to the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2024, the one that President Biden signed on May 16th of this year. Now this is law. We'll go into more detail of this, but there is language in that bill requires the FAA, quote, to determine whether alternative means of compliance, such as network-based remote ID, would satisfy the intent of the remote ID final rule. That's from the bill. So note it doesn't specifically mandate the network system. It just has to determine whether there's a better way to do something. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But this is the first time this language has existed. The bill is very recent. It's going to be around for the next 4.5 years. And it makes recommendations. And the recommendation that we're concerned about from the FAA bill is that the FAA must identify a path forward, how to provide real-time network data about the location and status of drones. This include identifying and assessing short-term and long-term options and clarifying roles and responsibilities. So as I mentioned, the GAO can't tell anybody to do anything, but the way the game is played in Washington, the GAO report is authoritative. It comes from Congress. Congress expects a response. The FAA responded. They go, we've got everything. We agree with the findings. We'll go ahead and do some research and detail our actions we plan to take on these recommendations. And the FAA, as well as Department of Homeland Security, have 180 days to respond on this. And after the response, we'll see what actions are taken to actually implement these recommendations. So as always, when you have these big issues and programs like remote ID and you're involving the FAA, the growth of a very large future industry with commercial drone operations, there's a lot going on in the background. The two things that I keep in mind, and I would urge recreational flyers like myself and others to keep in the back of the mind, is Congress is getting a lot of information on drones, and I'm speaking specifically on quadcopter unmanned drones. And the two things that I look at are these continuous incursions into airspace where the drones shouldn't be, and combat operations in Ukraine. The Ukraine war has been going on for about 2 years, and it's literally the world's first drone war. Drones have transformed just about everything, how armies think about fighting, with these very inexpensive items that are available for sale commercially, are literally transforming how things happen. To give you an idea how quickly things are changing in Ukraine, Ukraine is using 100,000 drones a month. I repeat, 100,000 drones a month in operations. That's about 3,300 drones a day are being used. It could be for reconnaissance, to take pictures, or in many cases, they carry munitions, and they're doing a very good job of countering Russian advances with these drones. Congress is aware of that, and they're extremely concerned with all this capability. What if something bad happens in the United States? Regarding airspace intrusions, there have been just too many cases of drones flying where they shouldn't be. There have been drones crashing on the White House lawns at 3 o'clock in the morning. There's about 1,000 reportings a month from the FAA of aircraft sighting drones in the air. And the other one I find interesting is the National Football League. They've logged about 2,500 drone sightings between NFL league games and college games. The reason that's important is the NFL is a business. They're very concerned about keeping things safe. There's a lot of people in a stadium that could be affected by an unsafe drone operation. And my viewpoint, the NFL is a big enough organization. If they think something needs to be done, they can make phone calls and get something to be done. And what they would push for in this case is if they see a drone, they can just almost instantly find out who is flying it where, which is going to mitigate against the broadcast system and be more ammunition to fuel the need for some sort of network-based remote ID system. The best way to counter this is just to be organized, don't violate the airspace in the first place, and just pay attention to things like this that are happening. So let's take a quick look at two sections of the FAA Reauthorization Bill of 2024 that affects us. Remember, this is law, and the way this game is played, what will happen is the bill will have somewhat vague language that will go through here. It'll go to the FAA. The FAA knows they've got to follow this because it's a bill. The FAA lawyers, staffers will look at this language, look at notes of meetings, see what the congressional intent was, and they'll eventually write regulations to comply with whatever this is after a given period of time. So the first one that's important, and the one relevant to this video, is Section 907 of the 2024 FAA Reauthorization Act. It says this section requires the FAA administrator to review and evaluate the FAA final rule titled, quote, Remote Identification of Unmanned Aircraft to determine if unmanned aircraft manufacturers and operators can comply through alternative means of compliance, including through network-based remote identification. The FAA shall submit to the appropriate committees of Congress a report on the results of this evaluation. So again, they have this information from the GAO on whether or not the broadcast remote ID is working. Commercial operators say no. The recreational operators say it's probably working fine with FRIAs. However, there's a push from the commercial operators for network-based identification, and the FAA is going to have to do something about this, a study to determine whether we pursue this, whether we don't, perhaps a network-based system for the commercial operators, let the recreational people fly without it. We don't know. The first step being a reply to the FAA, a reply from the FAA to Congress due within 180 days. Then we'll have to stay tuned for what comes after that. Now, one other thing that's interesting that's related to this, because it's in the bill to recreational flying, is Section 928. That is recreational operations of drone systems. This is interesting. I hadn't seen this before. This section directs, this is the 2024 FAA Reauthorization Act. This section directs the FAA to establish a process to approve and publicly disseminate the location of fixed sites at which individuals may carry out recreational UAS operations. So I'm not quite sure what that means. We'll have to wait and see. Does that mean you don't need remote ID in these areas, or they're simply fixed sites where you can carry out your drone or RC model aircraft flying? I don't know. This section permits the FAA to authorize recreational unmanned aircraft to fly above 400 feet within Class G airspace at fixed sites. So what's happening now, and I've mentioned this all along, once you start the conversation with the FAA recreational drone flyers, you can branch out from there to get improvements of what you want to do. Right now, drones and RC model aircraft are limited below 400 feet altitude, in most cases above ground. Here, the FAA is being authorized to allow recreational model aircraft to fly above 400 feet, but you still have to stay in Class G airspace. Class G airspace is uncontrolled airspace. The final sentence of Section 928 is quite interesting. It states, this section also directs the FAA administrator to prioritize FAA recognized identification areas, FRIA requests, submitted for fixed sites. Again, a FRIA is where a community-based organization like the Academy of Model Aeronautics, schools, can request a FRIA. They define the area where it is. The FAA reviews that, make sure it's not in controlled airspace and so forth. The key thing about a FRIA, if you're flying recreationally, you don't need any remote ID equipment in your RC model airplane. And a lot of people thought FRIAs were just a temporary fix that would go away. This establishes that FRIAs are important through at least September 30th, 2028. The Congress has directed the FAA to prioritize FAA FRIA requests for fixed sites. So I think that's a bit of good news for recreational pilots flying in a FRIA. So what is the way ahead of the 2024 FAA Reauthorization Bill of Remote ID? I don't really know. What I do know, as I mentioned, the GAO cannot direct anybody to do anything. They have asked, and the FAA has agreed to do a report on investigating remote ID to see if it's living up to its potential, what it was originally envisioned to do. The key question that GAO is asking, based on its interviews in the year preparing the report, the broadcast system is not working for commercial drone operators. The drone operators need a more robust system for remote ID that could be, they view a network system as the best way to do it. There is nobody on the recreational or small part-time Part 107 drone operators pushing for remote ID in a network system because of the cost, privacy issues involved in that. However, law enforcement agencies more and more are pressuring Congress and other agencies that when we see a drone, we want to find out very quickly who is flying that drone if we think it's being operated in an unsafe and illegal manner. And right now, the concern is with the broadcast remote ID, due to range limitations of the broadcast signal, the fact that the signal no longer broadcasts when the drone is back on the ground is not sufficient to meet that intent of the remote ID. So more to come, but this is absolutely a trigger for further work. And I think our best way to work this situation is through organizations like the Academy of Model Aeronautics. They have done, in my opinion, very good work forming the original remote ID rule with the broadcast-only system, advocating for FRIAs. We'll just have to see what happens in the future with this new thrust for a network-based system advocated very strongly by the commercial drone operators. Thanks for watching, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.